Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar presentation, Election Results and Thoughts with Brian Cove. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that today's webinar presentation is worth 1 CPE credit. In order to be eligible for that CPE credit, you must answer 3 of the 4 polling questions during the webinar and have a total viewing time of at least 50 minutes. The CPE credit will be available in 7 to 10 business days after the webinar. We are unable to grant CPE credit in cases where technical difficulty preclude eligibility. CPE program sponsorship guidelines prohibit us from issuing credit to those not verified by the technology to have satisfied the minimum requirements as stated. And according with the standards of the National Registry of CPE Sponsors, CPE credit is granted on a 50-minute hour. And now I'd like to introduce Roseanne Bump. She's the Executive Director of Twin Cities and here to welcome you to the program. Thank you, Roseanne.
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another one of our virtual events. It's great to see all of our members, strategic partners, and guests here today. While I'm making my announcements, I'd love to see a little chatter in the chat box. Please enter what company you're with or where you're joining us from, or really anything else you'd like to share. We're excited to host this session today with Brian Cove, FEI's Managing Director of Technical Activities and in-house lobbyist. There's certainly much to talk about on this topic, election results and insights. You may notice this session looks a little bit different than some of our others. One of the many benefits of FEI is the opportunity to connect and network with other professionals in the field. Immediately after this webinar, we'll be doing a brief networking session to help you make connections with others on the call. So for now, you can leave your camera and microphone off, and when the webinar ends, I'll invite everybody to join in the networking. And if you're not able to stay after, no problem, just leave the session as you normally would. So I hope to see all of you there. And throughout this session, please enter any questions you have into the chat box. I do want to share a few of our upcoming events. These can be viewed at feitwincities.com, and I'll pop that URL into the chat box when I'm done here so you can take a look and get signed up for one or more events. A couple of items I want to highlight. This Friday, we'll have a panel discussion on D&I in corporate America. Join panelists from the Twin Cities Diversity and Inclusion Roundtable in Hennepin Healthcare, Land O'Lakes, Marsh and McLennan, and Bank of America. This will be a good discussion. Look for our Vikings Bears tailgating party this coming Monday, November 16th. This will be just before the game starts. This will include prizes, a bit of trivia, and perhaps a bit of trash talking, all in good fun, of course. And next Thursday, we have a Cooking with Crocus Hill event. Cook along with us as we make a back to Baja menu. Rumor has it this pairs well with a margarita, so feel free to include that in your menu planning as well. So we hope you'll join us. With that, I'm going to get started. So I now have the pleasure of introducing Brian Cove, FEI's Managing Director of Technical Activities and in-house lobbyist. And before I turn it over to Brian, we're going to do our first poll. So I am going to launch that here. All right, if you can take a moment to answer that. Give us one more second or so. All right, I'm going to share the results, and then Brian, you can take it from here. All right, Brian.
Great. Thanks, Roseanne. And thanks to everybody for the invitation to meet with you all today to talk about the election. I guess the election was only a week ago, 8 days ago, but it seems like an eternity since then. And yet there's a lot that still remains to be settled. And as the polling question showed, everybody's happy that the election's over. And I think everyone's hoping we can just move forward. Anyway, while certain things are still up in the air, obviously, I do appreciate the opportunity to give you some thoughts on what we know so far and what might happen in Washington going forward once the new Congress and the new administration are in place in January. I'm going to share my screen. So just give me a second here. Just find it. I'm sorry. There it is.
Yep.
Having just a little technical difficulty here, I'm sorry. There we go. Sorry about that. Just wanted to mention the points I'm going to touch on today. We'll talk about the election results, where they stand. As I said, and as you know, not everything has been decided, but things are changing kind of daily. And I'll give you a quick update to kind of set the stage for what's going to happen next. There'll be a lame duck session, which has already started. The Senate is back in session. Then I want to go over some of the key points of Joe Biden's agenda for his administration, including his plans for COVID-19, his plans for healthcare, infrastructure, and I'll spend probably the most time on taxes, in particular corporate taxes, and then end with a few conclusions. We can't draw all the conclusions we'd like to right now with so much up in the air, but hopefully that'll give you some idea of what to expect, and then we'll have some Q&A. In terms of the election results, as everybody knows, Joe Biden's been projected as the winner by the AP and all the major networks. Obviously, the president is, and some Republicans are saying they don't feel it's been decided yet, and they're contesting the results in certain states. States that remain to be called, I have Alaska on here, but just this morning, Alaska was called for Trump. So there's 3 states left where the results haven't been called. That's Arizona, where Biden's ahead by less than 20,000 votes. There's Georgia, where Biden's ahead by 12 or 13,000 votes. And the governor or the state just announced they're going to do an audit of the votes there. And North Carolina, where Donald Trump's ahead by about 1.5 points, a little less than 2 points. It's likely that state will be called for Trump. It just hasn't been done yet. They're a little slow in counting the last 4 or 5% of the votes in North Carolina. If everything continues as it's going, where Biden keeps the lead in those states, Arizona and Georgia, he's on track to win 306 electoral votes, which interestingly enough is the same number of electoral votes that President Trump got back in 2016, which he declared as an electoral college landslide. As you can tell from the election results and just watching the news or talking to your friends, the electorate's incredibly polarized in the country. Both candidates received record number of votes. Right now, Biden's got about 75 million votes and they're still counting, and Trump has around 70 million. So while a record number for Biden, and there's still 70 million people that voted against him. So the polarization is going to continue, I think, into his administration. Unfortunately, it's just, I think a lot of people are just ready for everybody to try to work together a little more, but we'll see what happens. In the House and the Senate, the results are interesting. The House was expected to pick up anywhere from 5 to 20 new Democratic seats based on the pre-election polling in various states. Didn't really work out that way right now as of as of this morning, I updated the numbers on the slide here. The Democrats are going to retain control. They've been declared the winners in 218 seats, and that gives them the majority. The Republicans so far have won 201 seats, and there's 16 that remain outstanding as they're still counting votes. About 13 of those seats are probably going to go to Republicans, which means in the House, we're looking like there's probably going to be a 219 to or 218 to maybe a 4 or 5 seat majority for the Democrats. So that's the closest it's been in a long time, and it's going to make it more difficult, I think, to get anything through. One of the interesting things about the Republicans picking up so many seats is that it brings them very close to the majority, and it sets the stage in the midterm elections in 2022 for them to probably be in a good position to pick up control of the House, given that historically the ruling party, the party in control in the White House, generally loses seats in midterm elections. So there's a lot of optimism on the Republican side that they may have a chance to pick up the House in 2022. I know it's a little early to start thinking about the next election already, but that's the way people in Washington think. And that also will set the tone, I think, for cooperation between the two sides. While things are very polarized in the House as it is, the Republicans may be even less inclined to work together with the House on major initiatives with their eyes on picking up the entire House in 2022. So that'll be something to watch for. Nancy Pelosi has already announced she will seek to keep her seat as Speaker in the next Congress, which convenes in January. While there's a lot of I don't want to say infighting, but there's been a lot of discussion among the Democratic members of the House about why the election results were so disappointing, as the progressive wing and the more moderate wing of the party kind of blame each other for where things stand. Pelosi might get some opposition to running for Speaker again, although I think it's likely she gets reelected as Speaker. In the Senate, prior to the election, based on polling, the Democrats were projected to pick up at least 4 seats, and it was expected they would most likely pick up seats in North Carolina, Colorado, Maine, and Arizona. As it turned out, they only picked up seats in Arizona and Colorado. The incumbent Republican Tom Tillis in North Carolina hung on and won that race, and Susan Collins in Maine, who was expected, based on all the pre-election polling, was expected to lose her seat, actually won pretty easily with over 50% of the vote. So right now, the Democrats control 48 seats. The Republicans control 50 seats, with the Alaska seat being finally called this morning for the incumbent Senator Dan Sullivan. So everything, as you probably know from watching the news, is going to be determined by 2 runoff elections in Georgia. Georgia has a system where if in the Senate election, if you don't get 50% of the vote, then the top 2 finishers will have a runoff election. So that happened in both seats that were up in Georgia. And on January 5th, there will be a runoff in each of the seats. And generally, you would think that Georgia's 2 seats will go Republican. And if that's the case, then Republicans will retain control of the Senate. Mitch McConnell will be the majority leader, and he will set the agenda. However, it looks like, as you probably know, it looks like Joe Biden is going to win Georgia. You know, it's about a 14,000 seat lead he has right now. It's not expected that that's going to be overturned in an audit or a recount. So that shows obviously that things are changing in Georgia. It's not a traditionally red state as it had been in the past. And so that's giving Democrats hope that they may pick up may have a chance to pick up both of those seats in Georgia. Personally, I think I'd be surprised to see them pick up both seats. They have a better chance probably to pick up one, but again, in these crazy days of politics, all eyes are going to be on Georgia. I kind of pity anybody who lives in Georgia because after having been subjected to all the political advertisements and all the campaigning leading up to the election last week, they're now going to have to put up with it for another 6 weeks or so, as all resources and all the focus is going to turn to Georgia from both parties, because controlling the Senate is really going to be the key going forward, both for the Biden administration and for Democrats and Republicans. That's how their agenda is going to be determined, by who controls the Senate. As I mentioned, there's going to be a lame duck session. It's already started. The Senate's back in session. The top priority for Mitch McConnell, Senate Majority Leader, is a COVID relief package. As you may know, back in May, the House passed the HEROES Act, which is a $3.4 trillion package to bring relief to state and local governments, to individuals, to hospitals and first responders, to certain industries. Very broad, wide-ranging bill. Passed pretty easily in the House back in May and was sent over to the Senate, where the Senate did not act on it. Over the summer, Speaker Pelosi and Treasury Secretary Mnuchin spent weeks negotiating a reworked package. They had seemed to come close to agreement on a smaller package, a $1.9 trillion bill, and that had the backing of the president. However, as they got closer to the election, they suspended the negotiations. I think with the thinking, especially from Speaker Pelosi's side, was that they would deal with this after the election, especially given the pre-election polling, which projected that Democrats would be in control of everything in the new Congress. So I think there was less incentive for Speaker Pelosi to make any concessions. Leader McConnell has made passing something in the lame duck session a priority. The Senate Republicans want a smaller bill, and it's not clear whether they'll get something done. It's not clear whether Democrats would come around. I think it's unlikely they're going to come around, especially while control of the Senate is up in the air. I think the Democrats would rather wait until knowing who's going to control the Senate in January before they take up a bill. Whenever it comes up, whether it's in the lame duck session or in January, there are still some major areas of disagreement. Democrats have pushed for a significant amount of funding for state and local governments who have taken a huge hit from the pandemic. Top priority for McConnell and Republicans is including some kind of blanket liability for businesses. Democrats oppose that. They think it's too broad. And then there's all the other issues, like including stimulus checks, extending unemployment insurance, that there's not agreement on. Beyond the COVID relief package, some of the other issues that'll probably be brought up in the lame duck session are funding for the government. Temporary funding for federal agencies, which is done through 12 appropriations bills, was expired at the end of September. A temporary continuing resolution was enacted to provide funding through December 11th. So both Democrats and Republicans are going to have to work that out through the appropriations bills, and they are starting to work on that now. And it's expected that they will reach agreement by December 11th. Otherwise, the government will shut down. It's happened in the past, and it's no one in Washington wants that to happen, because everybody ends up looking bad if they let that happen. Some tax provisions may or may not be taken up. It's not clear. These tax extenders are these expiring tax provisions that seem to come up every year or so, and there's a last minute effort to renew them. It's not clear whether that's going to happen. Usually there's a lot of energy tax credits are among those that are going to be expiring. And then one of the kind of defining aspects of the McConnell-Trump partnership over the last 4 years has been filling federal judiciary vacancies. The Senate has filled hundreds of vacant federal judgeships that were left, many of them were left over from the Obama administration. And including among those now, McConnell has made it a priority to fill the seat vacated by Amy Coney Barrett when she left the Seventh Circuit in Indiana to take the Supreme Court seat that became open when Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away. So those are the main focuses of lame duck session that, as I said, is ongoing now and will continue through December. With that, I'd like to just talk on some of the major points of some of Joe Biden's agenda that he set out during the campaign. As he's talked about a lot, polling question.
Sorry, Brian, we'll give people a few minutes here not a few minutes,
Sure.
a little bit to answer this. All right, about 85% of you have answered. I am going to go ahead and end the poll and share the results. And Brian, we'll take it back to you.
Great, that's interesting. So about 55% of you think that tax policy will change the most, and I'm going to talk about that. I'm not sure if, well, like everything else, what gets done on taxes will be up in the air until the Senate control is determined, but I'll talk about that in a few minutes. One of the top priorities of the Biden, the incoming Biden agenda, Biden administration, is to address the COVID-19 pandemic. And as you can see on the slide, there's a number of things that they want to do. They want to double diagnostic testing via drive-through sites. They want to create a pandemic testing board that'll coordinate all the testing efforts in the US. They want to invoke the Defense Production Act to increase the amount of personal protective equipment for hospitals, medical workers, first responders. They also want to work with the CDC to issue more guidance to schools, businesses, households on how to best and most safely navigate the pandemic. They've also called for investing $25 billion in manufacture and distribution of COVID-19 vaccines, which is obviously a big issue. Everyone's aware of the Pfizer announcement earlier this week of the success they're having with their vaccine, and so the expectations are high. Also with COVID-19, Biden wants to establish a racial and ethnic disparities task force that will address how high-risk groups can be better protected from the pandemic. And they also want to restate and this was talked about a lot over the last year, reinstate the White House National Security Council's, the official name is Directorate for Global Health, Security, and Biodefense. That was their kind of pandemic preparedness office that the Trump administration had eliminated. And finally, they want the new president wants to call on state governors and local authorities to mandate mask wearing. I think there's not really an appetite to try to push for a federal mask mandate, so they're going to call on the state and local authorities to carry the water on that. Another significant aspect of Biden's agenda is healthcare, and the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, which was one of the key accomplishments of the Obama-Biden administration, has been, I guess you might say, under attack. As you may know, yesterday, the Supreme Court held a hearing on a suit brought by a number of states to eliminate the Affordable Care Act. The hearing was held. Given the questioning, it sounded like there wasn't support among a majority of the justices to strike down the law. Instead, maybe from the questioning, it seemed like the court may be more likely to just strike down the individual mandate and allow the rest of the law to stay in place. So the decision on that will be announced probably in May or June. There could be some time between now and then for Congress to revisit it, although I'm not sure it's likely, to try to address some of the issues. It's a possibility, but not likely. But we'll see what the Supreme Court rules later in 2021. The Biden administration also wants to expand the subsidies to make the ACA plans more affordable. That's one of the complaints, is that they're very expensive, even though they may offer some kind of catastrophic coverage. They're very high deductible and the premiums are expensive. So one of the priorities of the Biden administration would be to make them more affordable, and also to create a public option, which has been a high profile issue. Whether, there's been a lot of discussion of Medicare for all among the Democratic candidates in the primaries. Biden's response to that is to look into the creating of a public option, a government funded program. With Medicare and Medicaid, the Biden administration would like to expand eligibility by lowering the age requirement down to 60 years old. They'd like to add dental, hearing, vision coverage to the standard plan instead of, now that's only available through the supplemental plans. Obviously, that would be very expensive. There seems to be little appetite among congressional Republicans to expand the cost, especially given the size of the federal deficit due to the Tax Cut and Jobs Act and pandemic and COVID relief funding. There seems to be diminishing appetite to do anything to expand the federal deficit right now. The other issue that Biden said the Biden administration would like to address is drug and healthcare costs. They'd like to end surprise medical billing and also allow the federal government to negotiate drug prices for Medicare and Medicaid recipients. Interestingly, those are issues that, especially the negotiating of drug prices, was something that the Trump administration also tried to do. So that's one area where they apparently shared some common interest, Trump and Biden. The other area that's high priority for Biden is infrastructure. I know when Trump was first elected and came into office in 2017, it was thought that he may try to pursue a broad infrastructure package, working with Democrats in a collaborative way, create a lot of jobs, create some goodwill with the Democrats, an area where they could work together. The Trump administration never really came out with an infrastructure plan, although a running joke in Washington was every so often they would announce it was infrastructure week and they would try to publicize some infrastructure issues. So nothing was ever done on infrastructure. The Biden administration has a plan for infrastructure. Whether it'll happen or not, I don't know. It's an ambitious plan. It would cost about $2.4 trillion, and it would involve investing in clean energy technologies, improving roads, bridges, public transit, green spaces, water, electricity, and even would include improving universal broadband access. The focus would be on shifting energy sources to electricity and clean fuels, and to reduce emissions from trains, buses, passenger cars, other vehicles. Moody's estimates that the plan would create 18 million jobs by the year 2030 and would result in annual GDP growth of about 4.2% between 2020 and 2024. Those are positive things that the Biden administration has played up a lot in terms of the benefits of pursuing the infrastructure plan. However, one of the big issues, like everything else in Washington, is how to pay for it. Now, the Biden plan is based on the assumption that they're going to be able to raise the corporate tax rate up to 28% from the current 21%. raise the personal tax rate back up to 39.6% for incomes of $400,000 and above. And also they would be paying for this with increased tax revenue from the millions of new jobs that they say it would create. Whether that'll happen or not, again, depends on what goes on with the control of the Senate going forward. I know I sound like a broken record, but everything really kind of depends on who controls the Senate and what happens in the 2 Georgia special elections. Now taxes, want to spend a little time on taxes. As the poll showed, majority of you think that taxes, we'll see the biggest change in taxes. The key takeaways from Biden's tax plan are that it would restore tax rates on high earners and corporations. As I mentioned just previously on the infrastructure, it looks to raise the rates that were the kind of pre-Tax Cuts and Jobs Act rates that were in place. It also assumes that the increased revenue that would come from these higher rates would pay for new spending, like the infrastructure that I just discussed. Probably the most important key takeaway is that Democrats would need a Senate majority, or at least need to hold 50 seats in the Senate. If they hold 50 seats, then any tie votes would be broken by the Vice President, Kamala Harris. So again, keep coming back to the same thing. Democrats need to control the Senate to get a lot of this done for Biden. On personal taxes, as I mentioned, Biden's plan would restore the top rate of 39.6% for incomes of 400,000 and above. And that was something talked about a lot during the campaign. I would also raise the rate on capital gains and dividends up to 39.6% on incomes over $1 million. In terms of estate taxes, it would reduce the estate tax exemption by 50%. Biden would also eliminate the step up in basis at the time of death. And finally, the Section 199A deduction for pass-through income that was created in the Tax Cut and Jobs Act would be phased out over time for taxpayers with incomes of 400,000 or more. Biden's plan also would add or amend a number of tax credits, which are listed here on the slide, including expansion of the earned income tax credit, expansion of the child dependent care tax credit, and some other items that are there on the slide. With regard to corporate taxes, and I think a lot of you as CFOs are interested in this, obviously. The Biden plan would raise the corporate tax rate, as I mentioned, from the current 21%, which is what was established by the Tax Cut and Jobs Act in 2017. It would raise it to 28%. And a lot of the focus would be on onshoring and offshoring tax policy for Biden. It would include a 10% surtax on foreign profits of US firms that import goods. It would eliminate deductions for offshoring expenses, and it would establish a 10% tax credit for onshoring. It would also include some reforms to the global intangible low taxed income provisions of the TCJA, popularly known as GILTI. It would reduce the GILTI deduction from 50% to 25%. It would also impose a country by country minimum tax of 21% and eliminate the 10% QBAI deduction. The other main point of Biden's corporate tax plan would create a new alternative minimum tax. Corporations would pay the greater of ordinary tax liability or 15% on book income. And this would apply to firms with net income over $100 million. That book tax would include a credit for foreign taxes and a deduction for losses. Again, as I keep saying, control of the Senate will determine how much of this tax plan is adopted. If these things are done, it needs to be done legislatively, and that would require use of the budget reconciliation process, which was used on the Tax Cut and Jobs Act to get it through. It was also used on the Affordable Care Act, the Obamacare Act, back in 2010. And that's a process that normally in the Senate, something major like that would affect the deficit would require 60 votes. Now, with the margins in the Senate, no party is going to get 60 votes on anything as controversial as a tax law change. So they can invoke budget reconciliation on things that affect budget and spending. That way, they only need 51 votes, and that's how the Tax Cut and Jobs Act was passed, and that's what would be needed if Democrats control the Senate. If they cannot do things legislatively, then I think there's going to be a lot less activity on, or a lot less action on major changes to the tax code. I think what will happen is they will have to do things more through the regulatory process, and those will be more incremental changes. For example, on the GILTI issue, they may revisit the GILTI rules that came out after the TCJA was act, that provided a opt-out for companies that were already paying at least 18.9% in offshore taxes. There was a lot of criticism from the Democratic side that was a giveaway to large companies. So it is expected that if Republicans control the Senate, retain control of the Senate, and the Biden administration has to do things through the regulatory process, one of the things they may address is that GILTI exemption. But as I say, major tax changes are going to be a lot less likely without control of the Senate. I think it's doubtful even, everyone kind of going into the elections on the corporate side was getting prepared for a change in the corporate tax rate from 21%. Without control of the Senate, that's unlikely, and will, could probably stay the same. Biden plan's also quiet on, there are a number of tax provisions within the TCJA that were temporary and will be expiring in coming years. To date, Biden administration has been fairly quiet on most of those, and it could be that they take a look at that once they get in office and realize their ambitious agenda may not happen. But again, we'll have to see. Biden's one of the first things during the transition is trying to identify who's going to fill various cabinet seats. In addition to the cabinet running the federal agencies, the administration is going to be responsible for filling about 4,000 political appointments throughout the federal government, throughout the various agencies. About 1,200 or 1,400 of those would require Senate confirmation. So obviously, that's going to take up a lot of time in the Senate for the first few months of the year. I just want to mention one key cabinet position because there is so much interest in tax, and is who might be nominated to run the Treasury Department. A lot of people have thrown out the name of Senator Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts. Not sure she'd be so business friendly. I think it's probably unlikely that she would get nominated, just given the situation in the Senate. If she left her Senate seat, it would be, at least on a temporary basis, filled by someone appointed by the governor of Massachusetts, who's a Republican, which would mean he would most likely, almost certainly, appoint a Republican for the seat, and that would take one Democratic seat away from the Democrats. Then they need them. So I think that would probably play into any consideration of Elizabeth Warren. The chatter in Washington so far has been the leading contender seems to be the Federal Reserve Board Governor Lael Brainerd. Other names up for consideration are former Fed Governor Sarah Raskin and the former Fed Chair Janet Yellen. The cabinet nominees will most likely be named sometime in December. That's going to be, as I said, a key part of the transition, and there'll be a lot of vetting and discussion internally within the Biden transition team. So I would look for those candidates to be named sometime in December. And then again, as I said, they'll have to go through the confirmation process. There's some talk if the Senate is controlled by Republicans going forward, that may have some influence on who Biden picks for certain cabinet posts, understanding that they may have to get through Republican scrutiny. But again, we'll see how all that goes once the Senate control is decided in January. So just conclusions, as again, broken record. Everything depends on Georgia right now. Some early polling done by some Republicans that was released this morning showed that Republican, and again, who can trust polling after last week's election results, but I'll mention it anyway. Some early polling showed that the Republicans in both the races were slightly ahead. Both polls were in the margin of error, but there's going to be millions of dollars of resources dumped into the state from both the Republican and Democratic side to try to influence how the voting goes. And January 5th, we'll know, and that's going to determine how much of this agenda goes. As I said, the feeling seems to be that it would be, it's a long shot for Democrats to take those 2 seats. If they don't, and Republicans can retain control of the Senate, what can we expect in Congress and with the new administration going forward? I guess the choices are compromise or gridlock. President Biden served in the Senate for several decades. He was known for working across the aisle with his Republican colleagues, and throughout the campaign, he touted his ability and his willingness to work with Republicans. So there is the chance there could be compromise, or there's a chance there could be kind of the Obama era gridlock where Republicans don't want to Republicans and Democrats don't want to work together. We saw this on things like the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. The Republicans basically wrote the bill and got it through both the House and Senate, which they both controlled at the time, without any consultation with their Democratic colleagues. And this is, historically, both sides would work together on major legislation like that. Obviously, the party in control would have more influence on the finished product. But there's a lot of kind of, I want to say, bad blood between Democrats and Republicans. We saw that when we did our advocacy on the Tax Cut and Jobs Act back in 2016 and 2017. We would meet with Democratic staff and they would say, "What are you hearing from the Republicans? We don't even know what's in the bill." So there's a lot of bad blood still on the Hill, and they have long memories. So whether both sides will come together and compromise on major initiatives, remains to be seen. I'm a little cynical. I've been around Washington a long time. I have a feeling there's going to be more gridlock than compromise. For the Biden administration, they may want to just wait for 2022. That's when the next midterm elections are. And there are a number of Senate seats. Usually one third of the Senate comes up at every 2 years. There's a number of Republican seats coming up that the Democrats think they can control, or they can win. If that's the case, if Democrats don't get control of the Senate after Georgia in January and get it in 2022, that might be where you'd see major initiatives happening for the Biden administration. But again, sorry to be so wishy-washy about all this, but there's a lot still up in the air. I hope that was helpful. I hope that was interesting. Any questions? Certainly glad to try to answer them.
Thanks, Brian. I did launch a poll, and so I will go ahead and do a share results, and maybe you can talk a little bit on that.
Great. So it seems like with regard to the economy. I think, it's interesting. I think what's the determining factor there may end up being how the pandemic is dealt with when things start to get back to normal. I mean, certainly GDP or economic growth has rebounded, I think, better than expected from where it was in the second and third quarter. I think one of the considerations is, I think we're going through this second wave or third wave, depending on how you define it, and how bad is that going to be, and what kind of impact is that going to have on the economy? But in terms of how taxation is going to impact that, again, it's still all up in the air. I think if I had to bet, it's more likely that we're not going to see major changes to corporate or personal income tax, as I expect the Republicans will keep control of the Senate. I'll just look at a few of the questions that have been posed.
Brian, I can hop in and share. I know there's probably a lot in the chat box.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to do that, that'd be
Sure.
maybe easier.
Any chance Biden's personal tax agenda, if passed, gets implemented retroactively to 2021, or would you expect them to start in 2022?
Oh, I think it'd be difficult to do it retroactively. I think that creates a lot of problems, even just on the kind of administration side. I mean, I think the IRS would explode. But if they, it's going to take a while to get anything through if they can. So I think that's unlikely. Most things would get implemented retroactively.
Thank you. Here's another question that came through. If the Senate remains under Republican control, how does that impact cabinet and related appointments? I think you touched on this briefly, but.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk that if the Senate is controlled by Republicans, and that means they would chair the committees that are responsible for the confirmations of the various appointees. If they're too progressive or considered, have positions that Republicans don't agree with, that they're going to block those. Traditionally, historically, the Senate would show a lot of deference to to a new president's cabinet nominees. But again, this comes back to the way things are just more polarized than they've ever been. It's not clear whether that consideration will be taken by Biden as he selects various nominees for cabinet positions. I mean, one thing is those nominees will probably all be named before Senate control is determined in January. It's expected that most of the nominees, at least at the highest levels, will be selected and announced sometime in the first part of December, probably around the middle of December. So that's going to be very interesting to watch. I think Biden generally is, he knows how the Senate works, and I think he's going to keep in mind the viability of a candidate getting confirmed when he selects them.
Great, thank you. Here's another one that came through. Regarding the COVID relief pending legislation, am I correct in that the major difference has been that Trump and McConnell do not want any COVID money to go to bailout states and cities that have overpromised on governmental pension benefits? That is not COVID related. Agreed?
Well, I think generally that's definitely something that's been raised. What Trump has said, and McConnell has maybe not been as vocal about it, but I think supports the position, is that as Trump calls that, Trump says the blue states and blue cities have mismanaged the COVID situation, and they're looking for a federal government bailout. Now, I think what's been proposed by the Democrats is across the board aid for states and cities that have been impacted by there's been obviously a loss of tax revenue and increased expenses and costs and trying to deal with the pandemic. I think what's coming into play here as much as anything is now there's an appetite on the Republican side to limit adding to the federal deficit. The Tax Cut and Jobs Act added about over $2 trillion to the deficit. The first several COVID relief packages certainly added to the deficit. And now with Biden in charge, I think you're going to hear a lot more about limiting federal spending. And I think that's what's going on there on that issue with state and local governments.
Right. Here's another question. What are you currently advocating for from the FEI national level?
Well, we do a lot of the position we take are through our Committee on Private Companies. And I encourage any of you work for a private company to get involved in the Committee on Private Companies. We have it really split up into 4 groups. There's a family business and succession planning group. There's a access to capital and M&A group. We've got operations and administration, and we have a legislation, regulation, accounting standards, and advocacy group, which kind of coordinates our advocacy effort on things of interest to private companies. And we were very active on the Tax Cut and Jobs Act advocacy, especially with regard to pass-through businesses and the 199A deduction, estate taxes, things like that. So the group's meeting, that group will be meeting in December, and we're going to set our agenda for kind of our legislative agenda, what we'd like to accomplish going forward. And again, some of that's going to be determined by who controls things in Washington. Our Committee on Taxation, which is comprised of tax directors and senior tax executives from larger companies, will also be looking at what they may want us to pursue in 2021. I think those guys on our Committee on Taxation are going to be happy that the corporate tax rate likely won't go up unless the Democrats win those 2 Georgia seats. But again, we're taking the month of December to really set the agenda going forward.
Perfect. I have one last question. If anybody has questions, please enter them into the chat box and we'll make sure they get shared. What are some of the ideas suggested around ending surprise medical billing?
This was something that that was considered in the House and the Senate in the past year, especially once the pandemic hit and people were getting hit with a lot more medical expense. And it looked at some point like like there was broad support for it. And even the White House, even the Trump administration expressed support for it. And I know there was a really vigorous lobbying campaign done by some medical organizations, doctors groups, and it seemed to kind of go off the rails in the Senate. I didn't follow it all that closely, so I'm not sure about the specific details about why it was stalled, but I think there's still support for that, especially again with the pandemic continuing and record number of cases over the past week or 10 days. It's going to continue to be an issue. So I would look to see that something that comes back on the Senate, and certainly something that's going to be pushed by the incoming Biden administration.
Thank you. Another question, does the Committee on Taxation membership include both private companies and public companies?
There are a couple of large private companies. It's primarily public companies.
Thank you. And then if we end up with a gridlock, is that not a better situation for business?
You know, sad to say, but probably, it's not the way, the legislative process is supposed to work. But I think, depending on what you'd like to see happen, I mean, especially from the tax perspective, I think a lot of what's in the Biden plan is something most companies probably wouldn't prefer over the existing TCJA. And so gridlock is going to mean that, as I said, major changes are not going to happen. So, I think gridlock probably benefits a lot of people, and that's why it's likely we're going to see it.
Mm-hmm. You've mentioned that everything's up in the air right now. How long do you think it'll be till we have some semblance of an answer?
Well, again, January 5th is going to, that's when those two Georgia elections are. And, it's very unusual for a state to have two Senate seats up at the same time. It just so happened that there was a senator in Georgia retired for health reasons, and his seat was appointed on a temporary basis to Kelly Loeffler. And the way Georgia law is that her term only lasted until the next election, and at the same time, coincidentally, the other Georgia seat was up for re-election on its usual time frame. So there are two seats there coming up. It's going to be January 5th. And that's where the entire political world in the US is going to focus on until January. There's going to be a lot of polling telling you how it's going to go. So if you believe the polls anymore, I don't know how many people do. That might give you a sense before January of how things are going to play out. But, at best, if the Democrats did win the two seats in Georgia, it's going to be a 50-50 Senate with tie votes broken by the vice president. So neither side would really have a huge advantage, although Democrats would have the slight advantage. But we won't know until January, and then things will come together pretty quickly after January 5th.
Great. That looks like the majority of our questions have been answered here. I appreciate your time today, Brian. I do have a fourth poll that I am going to launch. While I am doing that, maybe Nancy can finish up the session here. And I do want to remind everybody to stick around if you can and do some networking with us.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Brian. That was very informative, and I'm sure the folks in Twin Cities really appreciated all those comments. For those of you who are earning CPE credits today, you do have 7 to 10 business waiting days until that credit will be released. Again, we will open up everybody's microphones so that you can have some conversation with Brian.
Terrific. Thank you, Nancy. And yeah, now we'll open it up into the network piece of it. And I'm going to stop the recording here.